Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Now, oil provided fuel for the machines of war and was essential for both sides. And Dr. Toprani returns for part two of his discussion about this vital material and the various ways the protagonists attempted to produce it, move it, purchase it, store it, and deny it to the other people. I will just say before I bring in my guest, he is speaking as an individual. He does work for the government, but these are his own views. That's the disclaimer out there about his interpretation of the subject. So I'll bring him. Good afternoon, sir. How are you today?
Fine. Thank you for having me for part two. I'll try not to be as long-winded this time around.
Well, people love the long-windedness of it. So we more or less stuck to the pre-war era last time. But before we get into how the actual first shots of World War II changed the country's policy, just kind of recap briefly where the world was in terms of its oil production and the economy and what have you in 19 or leading up to 1939.
So I think it's the point that I would always want to emphasize to people looking at this period is that don't look at the world oil map today and think it maps onto the pre-World War II period. There's this belief that the Middle East has always been the center of world oil production. And starting in the 1950s and 60s, you can make an argument that that is true, but it is not true, before the Second World War. There's only, Iran is an established producer going back to, the beginning of the 20th century, the discovery of oil in 1908. But beyond Iran, which is, again, primarily supplying British markets east of Suez, and because of the relationship between Anglo-Persian and the Royal and the British government as a major supplier to the Royal Navy, but it is a sort of niche supplier in a very specific market. You have minor oil production in Iraq. There's discovery of oil in Kuwait in 1938, but it's deliberately throttled back because there's no place to absorb it. There's too much oil on the world market. Nothing in Saudi Arabia, nothing in Libya, North Africa. So don't think of the world today, the world of 1939. Don't make the mistake of confusing it with the world today. The center of world oil production before the Second World War is the Western Hemisphere. Right. It is the United States as the world's largest oil producer and also the world's largest oil consumer, and it is Venezuela, which is either the world's second or third largest producer, and certainly its largest exporter, because Venezuela has no internal consumption. These massive amounts of oil are going abroad, and they are primarily going to Europe. Venezuela is the primary overseas supplier for Europe before the Second World War. So that means you're relying on overseas imports from the Western Hemisphere, and this cannot be stressed strongly enough. These imports must be paid for in dollars or foreign exchange. That is it. You are not using block currency, soft currency, no Reichsmarks that can't be exchanged. It's got to be gold or close to it, and that means the US dollar. And if you do not have foreign exchange, you cannot get access to this stuff, even if you can secure your supply lines. Britain and France don't necessarily have to worry about security of the supply lines, but they do have to worry about whether or not they can afford to import oil from the Western Hemisphere at the same time that they're importing any number of other goods from the Western Hemisphere, particularly high-end goods, aircraft parts, engines, airframes, what have you, which also require payment in foreign exchange and also impose restrictions on your tanker, on your transportation tonnage because of U.S. neutrality legislation as well. So that's the sort of situation if you were looking to import. Germany, of course, as I pointed out, goes a separate path. The Germans understand well before the Third Reich that they can't protect their overseas imports. They have to sort of move towards synthetics. So that had been one of the impetuses for the synthetic fixation of nitrogen before the First World War. You worried because you weren't able to import bat guano from the Pacific. You wouldn't be able to produce synthetic nitrates that are essential for production of munitions and, of course, for fertilizer as well. You have synthetic fixation of nitrogen, which allows you to basically replace that. So there's already the synthetic industry that's developed. The synthetic industry, of course, has a byproduct of large amounts of hydrogen. That hydrogen can then be used to sort of basically liquefy Germany's coal through the Haber-Bosch process, and there are other ones, Fischer-Tropsch and others, but the Haber-Bosch process is the main one because that's the patent that's owned by IG Farben, the major German chemical conglomerate and one of the largest firms in the world, and sort of, one of the sort of foundations of the German war economy, which is heavily reliant on synthetics. But of course, if you are relying on synthetics, you are using tremendous amounts of primary and intermediate goods, so coal, electricity, steel, using tremendous amounts of primary and intermediate goods to produce another intermediate good, which is petroleum. Like, this is not ideal. You should be using these things to produce finished goods. That coal, that steel, that labor could be used to produce tanks, could be used to produce planes, ships, artillery, munitions, but you cannot do that because you need to produce fuel for those things. So synthetic fuel is really not an ideal sort of, it is a remarkable feat of scientific development and industrial planning and policy. It is, for all intents and purposes, the Germans' Manhattan Project. I mean, people like to talk about the V2 as their big thing, and that happens, during the war, and it is a significant drain, but it's nothing compared to synthetic fuel. I mean, there is no German war effort with synthetic fuel, and they literally created out of thin air because, again, it cannot be imported. You'd like to be able to get more oil, but again, the Middle East is not really a feasible supplier. And ironically, Italy is sitting on this ocean of oil in Libya, but no one using the technology of that period is really, there are indications that there's oil in Libya, but no one really has the capacity at that point to be able to sort of drill for it. So it's ironic that all these battles are happening in 41 and 42 about sort of access to the Middle East when you already had more oil than you could imagine, but you're not really able to get at it. The other option for getting that oil is going to be the Soviet Union, which again is sort of, regained its traditional position, Russia's traditional position as the world's sort of second or third largest oil producer. But again, very little of that oil is exported because the Soviets are industrializing and militarizing. So they only have a tiny, tiny amount of oil that they can afford to export. They use that as a lever with the Germans in order to sort of secure the Nazi aggression pact. And Stalin is very, and we can discuss this more, later on, but Stalin is also using this as a sort of, as a carrot to try and keep the Germans happy, but also yank their chain if they're getting a little bit too big for their britches. So and I mean, did you want me to talk about the Pacific at all?
Sure, later on. I mean, as you just mentioned the Soviet Union and Russia there, I think we did a show a couple of years ago about all these sort of German military officers that are visiting Russia and the wider Soviet Union all through the late 1930s. And of course, there is the pact there. Yeah. When we talk about Operation Barbarossa, there's obviously this, but it's ideology and it's all about the oil fields. How much does the Third Reich know about the Soviet Union's oil production, how it's moving its oil around, where it's storing it before, as they enter into World War II, or in fact, while they're part of the pact? What's their intel on the Soviet Union in terms of a player in the oil industry?
Yeah, well, you need to also bear in mind that during the sort of the period what I call the Rapallo era, really in the 1920s through until about the mid 1930s, it doesn't quite stop with the Nazis coming to power, but it certainly tails off, and then there's a brief resurgence from 39 to 41. German industry, there was intense sort of cooperation between German military and the Red Army, later the Soviet Army, obviously. Yeah. But it's in the Red Army and during this period where the Red Army is allowing the German army to test certain weapon systems that are banned by the Versailles Treaty, like tanks and aircraft and poison gas, and in various bases in the Soviet Union. There is also a degree of cooperation between German industry and the Soviet Union as well. I mean, it lasts, arguably until Russia invaded Ukraine. This was always the great vision of German industry, that somehow German industry and capital could be used to sort of exploit the natural resources of the Eurasian landmass of Russia and sort of bind these two countries closer together. So there's this sort of confluence of interest between German industry that is looking for markets, the German military, which is looking for a place to sort of escape the shackles of Versailles, but also looking towards the traditional sort of Bismarckian approach of approaching Russia as a means of sort of denying it as an ally to France or the UK, which is arguably the great Wilhelmine Germany's greatest foreign policy blunder when Wilhelm II gets rid of the reinsurance treaty, an attempt to sort of build this German-Russian sort of condominium, which persists even after the Soviet Union becomes a communist sort of regime as well. The German military is still very, very keen on developing this relationship, and is actually one of the points of friction with the regime, because the regime, and I know this is sort of controversial, the regime is obviously very anti-Soviet from the very get-go because of its ideology, and it sees Poland and other Eastern European countries as potential allies against the Soviet Union. But the German military, because of its sort of class and aristocratic, background, tends to take a very dim view of the Poles and other Eastern Europeans, and wants to ally with the other sort of master race in Europe to keep these people down and sort of rule Europe together. And so there is a sort of friction where the regime is actually pushing for closer relations with Poland, including the non-aggression pact in 1934, and trying to sort of woo the Poles into sort of this pan-European crusade that only fails at the beginning of 1939, while the military is pushing towards this idea that no, we should be working more closely with the Soviet Union and leveraging them. But of course, that's because if you do that, you cannot seek Lebensraum, in Eastern Europe as well, which is again another point of friction with the National Socialist regime. But to answer your original question about was there knowledge of the Soviet oil industry? Yes, there was intense study of the Soviet oil industry right up through, even during the war itself, but certainly beforehand. There was an office, it was called the Preußische Geologische Landesamt, which then becomes under the Third Reich, the Reichsamt für Bodenforschung, sort of Reich agency for geological research is the best way to. I mean, I don't want to be trite by saying like it's the equivalent of the United States Geological Survey.
Right.
As a part of this, you have experts who are analyzing the Soviet oil industry very carefully. They are looking, they are aware of what are the limitations of the Soviets in terms of supplying Germany. They are looking at production, transportation, refining capacity. They are also dimly aware of the fact that the center of gravity of Soviet oil production is starting to shift. It's still early on, but it is starting to shift from the Caucasus, where Azerbaijan, what is today Azerbaijan, Baku and other areas. It is starting to shift from these areas, which are more developed, to the Volga, Urals, and then perhaps even ultimately into Siberia. But that is something that they are seeing will happen over the course of the following decades. But they are aware that there are multiple areas in the Soviet Union which have potential to be a major sort of producer of oil in the future. But again, that's all going to take time and tremendous amounts of capital to be able to sort of not just find that oil, but also extract it and transport it to where it needs to be. Most of that effort and analysis is for obvious reasons devoted towards the Caucasus, because that is what Germany can actually get to. The Volga, Urals, and Siberia is simply too far away, even in the sort of most sort of grandiose of of the Nazis' genocidal fantasies.
Okay, thank you. You'd mentioned that North Africa, and Trevor Sheehan, our resident Tunisia expert, is saying, had the Axis any idea about the Libyan oil potential? I mean, you mentioned the fact that everybody's fighting in Libya and Egypt and Sudan in that early part, 41, 42, but then obviously there have been all sorts of geological surveys going there for decades. Was there anything, ever a point where the Nazis thought about doing something in that part of the world at that, or is that it all came sort of 20, 30 years later?
No, yeah, the Nazis are not really thinking about oil in Northern Africa, because it's also, you have to bear in mind that Northern Africa and the Mediterranean is not their sphere of influence. They have they have given that to the Italians. Like, that is a sort of implicit price of originally Italians are very skeptical of the Nazis because they want to maintain an Austrian buffer state, and they are concerned about German encroachments into southern and southeastern Europe, which the Italians see in their sort of, in Mussolini's vain fantasy of recreating the Roman Empire, they see as their sort of sphere. So there is absolutely no German sort of exploration or efforts. I mean, there's brief sort of cursory research about the economic potential of North Africa and the African continent more generally, but that's not really the focus of their efforts, because again, that is something that they are going to leave to the Italians. Now, I would have to sort of do more research on that. There is an Italian sort of state-owned oil company, AGIP, which is doing some geological surveys within the Italian Empire, but actually the place where they think that there's more likely to be oil is, of all places, Albania. That's actually where they're thinking they might find more oil. They're not really doing as much as you would imagine in Libya. It's, again, there unfortunately are not a lot of scholars who look at the Italian side of things, strangely enough, and that is probably a mistake of mine that I did not learn Italian and did not try to do this work, because I'm certain there is a fair bit of material out there, but AGIP is not really interested in that. They are thinking about trying to sort of develop oil in the Middle East, and there is a sort of abortive effort between 32 and 36 to create a German-Italian company that will explore for oil in portions of Iraq that are not covered by the sort of Anglo-American consortium, the Iraq Petroleum Company, which dominates most of oil production in Iraq. The Iraqis want to have competition. They want to invite other people who will give them a better deal. They try to, it's actually a British, initially set up by a British or Scottish businessman, actually, and he tries to get German and Italian capital involved in that, but ultimately they're unable to make that work because of the sheer cost and complexity of developing that oil. Because even if you find oil, and there was oil in the parts of Europe, in the parts of Iraq that these people were interested in, the problem of actually transshipping that oil to the Mediterranean coast and then shipping it to Germany or Italy is simply too complicated. It can't be protected in the event of war. And there are rumors, it's never been entirely proven, but there are rumors that the British convince the Italians to give up their stakes in Iraq in order, and this is also happening at the time of the Ethiopian crisis, mind you, by promising not to embargo oil imports into Italy as a result of Italian aggression. I mean, this are the Germans who are claiming that. It's never been actually proven, but it is something worth, probably worth exploring in greater detail. But again, the Italians are looking in various places, but there's not really any sustained effort to do a proper sort of evaluation of Libya. And as far as I can tell, the technology did not exist at that time to be able to process that oil. And even if it did, the cost of it would be so astronomical, it would make no commercial sense for any firm to sort of invest in that. And Italian and German firms do not have that knowledge and expertise and capital. The Western firms really have no interest in doing that either until after the Second World War.
Thank you. And you made it very clear in the first show that the discovery of crude oil is only the first part of it. It's refining, transportation, storage, all those things you talked about. How the lengths of time you can keep these commodities under storage, things like that. So people are asking already in the sidebar about Romania, and particularly the Americans watching this. It's all because of the fame of the the strategic bombing efforts and the Plesty and the loss of all those big 4-engine bombers and et cetera, et cetera. So we touched on Romania in the first show, but just explain Romania's significance because it's synthetic fuel, but real fuel as well. So it's going to run down on Romania. Then I'll move to Japan.
Yeah. So, within Europe itself, if you're going to look for oil, like where might you find it? There's tiny amounts of oil in Alsace, which is a disputed territory between France and Germany, and around Peckelbronn. There's some. There had been briefly before the First World War. Austrian Galicia, which is after the First War, is mainly a part of Poland. Austrian Galicia was actually at one point, I think, the world's third largest oil producer, behind the United States and Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. But those oil fields are pretty much played out even before the First World War, and there's a lot of damage to them during the Russian occupation of Galicia in 1914, 1915, and it's never really able to recapture. A lot of the oil is also wasted. It's extracted, using very sort of, it's extracted using very, archaic sort of, methods, which reduces the sort of the total yield of the field. So it never is able to sort of recapture what it had once been. There is oil shale, which is different from shale oil. I want to be clear. Shale oil is the thing that you find, shale, oil that's trapped within shale formations you find in Texas and other places. Oil shale is like this rock that has a basically has a high sort of petroleum content that can be treated. There's some of that in Estonia and others, but it is extremely, and Scotland is also a major sort of source of oil shale. It is extraordinarily expensive and energy intensive to be able to extract that oil. It's not really an energy winner for you. The only oil producer of any consequence in Europe is going to be Romania. It's just crude oil, and it is primarily going to be in the eastern side of Romania. It is the only crude oil supplier of any significance within Europe. The Germans had been a major player in Romania before the First World War, mainly through the Deutsche Bank. It has a subsidiary known as Stoia Romana, but it loses all those interests after the First World War. So it is pushed out, and Romania is dominated by British, French, and Dutch. By British, Dutch, Shell. By Dutch I mean Shell, and some American companies as well.
Right.
They're the ones who are dominating Romania's oil production, and they are using that oil not really to supply Germany. They're using it to supply other people within Europe, and they're not shipping it over land or via the Danube. They're shipping it to Costanza on the Black Sea, and then shipping it around through the Straits and to markets all around that way. So it is a supplier of oil, but it is one that is dominated by Germany's adversaries and has and the infrastructure to redirect those oil flows from overseas markets to Germany and other inland markets does not exist. It has to be created, on the fly under wartime constraints. To add further complications, the Romanians in the First World War had sabotaged their own, or they had not. They had allowed the British and the French to sabotage their oil industry, their oil fields, before the Germans had occupied the country in 1916, 1917. There are tales about how effective the sabotage was. It turns out like it was fairly effective, but there's only so much you can do. I mean, it held back Romanian production for maybe a year or something like that, and that in the First World War, that is fairly significant. It doesn't destroy that production, but there is an awareness that on the Germans' part that they have to treat Romania with kid gloves. And we don't necessarily think of the Germans as sort of bending over backwards to look at, to out of concern for their allies or their satellites' feelings. But Romania has a certain degree of leverage because everyone in Germany, including Hitler, understands what had happened in the First World War. So they have to treat Romania with kid gloves. But that's also problematic because Romania has problems with two other countries. One, it has a problem with Hungary, over the fate of Transylvania. And Hungary is another ally of Germany, and Hungary also has small amounts of oil production as well. So you've got your own allies that are sort of squabbling with one another, and of course there's the Soviet Union, which at that time has a border with Romania, and the Soviets are very keen on being able to get their hands on what the Romanians call Bessarabia, but today is known as Moldova, and that creates an additional point of friction. And finally, Hitler is also well aware of the fact that Allied air power based in places like Greece or Crete, or even the Eastern Mediterranean, could theoretically reach Romanian oil fields and devastate oil production there as well. So it is a potential source, but it's not a lot of oil when you consider it, and there are a lot of political and economic constraints. The Romanians want certain things, in exchange for that oil. They're going to demand the Germans sort of, pay a dear price for it, and there are, significant constraints on your ability to move it to where you need it to go. And of course, the Romanians have an interest in not sort of holding oil production down as much as possible, to not allow the Germans to basically sort of, suck them dry either as well, to maintain their leverage for as long as possible. So it's a very complicated scenario.
Okay, thank you. I feel we're going to return to Romania and Europe later on, but let's bring the Pacific in, because as a Brit and the Japanese expansion of their empire, I was told as a young man, it was all about rubber. That was what it was all about, Malaya and rubber. But of course, like everything else, they need a whole host of raw materials. How does Japan's thinking about oil affect their domination plans, shall we say?
Yeah. So Japan has virtually no oil production, either within the home islands or even within Japan's sort of growing empire in Northeast Asia and Manchuria, Korea. It of course owns Taiwan, what they called Formosa back then. So Japan is in a terrible position when it comes to energy. It has some coal production, but again, and there is a lot of coal in Manchuria, but again, no oil production. And if you're going to get oil, virtually, before Japan makes a decision, basically before 1940, and when the U.S. first starts leveling sanctions, and especially in 41 when they basically cut off oil exports, about 80 to 90% of Japanese oil imports come from the United States, not from the East Indies, which is what you would think. They actually come from the United States, because the East Indies is the only major producer of oil within Southeast Asia. But there are so many demands for it, and it tends to be also a very high sort of quality, oil that, ultimately you've got a lot of people sort of scrambling for it. The Japanese are actually going to be supplied primarily from the United States, from oil fields in California and others, which are looking for an outlet in the Far East. So the Japanese are in this position where they can get oil, but it can only come from the United States. And the moment you do anything to annoy the United States, then you are in real trouble. The problem starts not about oil, not about rubber, but it's about China. That right. China is ultimately the be-all, end-all of the Japanese army's sort of expansionist sort of foreign policy. It's worth bearing in mind. Japan had a quasi sort of constitutional, even though the emperor was a living god, it was sort of moving towards this position, not quite of having a parliamentary democracy and a constitution. It had a parliament, it had a constitution. It's sort of moving in that direction that is sort of similar to something that you might see in the West. But ultimately, and I don't want to sort of get into the details about this, the Japanese army and the navy are able to basically thwart any attempts by civilian leaders to sort of yank back, to hold back Japanese expansionism. The Japanese had acquired an empire starting in 1895 when they defeated China. It expanded after defeating Russia in 1905, and it had continued to expand thereafter. It is primarily focused on Northeast Asia, Manchuria, which then was a sort of vast hinterland, which was seen as being a huge source of raw materials and a magnet for Japanese imperialism and Japanese colonists from the overpopulated home islands. It is their, in a sense, it is their Lebensraum. The problem with that is that you were only able to take that territory because Russia had been weakened, Russo-Japanese War, and then it had sort of collapsed in the revolution. So Russia had sort of moved, temporarily moved back, and China had, after the revolution and the overthrow of the last Qing emperor, it had collapsed into sort of revolution and warlordism. So Japan is able to sort of expand its sphere in Northeast Asia. It takes over the German colony at Qingdao. It is trying to create this empire in Northeast Asia, but then things start to go a little bit, sideways, in the sense of the Soviets do start to return. The Soviets do return, and they do have an interest in the fate of Northeast Asia because, of course, they have Vladivostok and other territories they need to worry about. They are a Pacific power. China is also still fragmented, still weak, but it is gradually being unified. The warlords are slowly sort of being eliminated or bought off by the Kuomintang regime that is led by Chiang Kai-shek, which is slowly but surely, starting in the south, moving north, is unifying the country, and also getting rid of is on the verge in the mid-1930s of getting rid of the last remaining opposition, which comes primarily from the Chinese Communist Party, who have to basically flee into the hinterland to avoid being exterminated. So the Chinese are growing, and Chinese nationalism is becoming a force, and Chinese nationalism is increasingly directed against Japan, which is seen as being an imperial power, like the Western powers, that is infringing upon China's sovereignty and is sort of contributing to what the Chinese today call the sort of century of humiliation. So the empire is looking increasingly weak, and this leads to a choice. We can either give up this empire and have good relations with the Chinese, or we can take steps to keep China weak or coerce them into accepting our domination. And the problem is, the Japanese clients, and they had created a client regime led by a warlord in Manchuria. This guy is, I can't get into too much detail, but he ends up being defeated, and he's on the verge of collapse. The Japanese make the decision, well, maybe we should assassinate him and get his son, who into power, who will do a better job. They do kill the warlord. It turns out that his son, who is an opium addict, is actually not terribly thrilled about what the Japanese have done, and he actually allies with Chiang and tries to broker a settlement between Chiang and the communists against Japan's. So the Japanese find themselves in this weird position where they had they had thought that they could use their clients to sort of seize this area. So then the Japanese army makes its own decision to invade Manchuria under a false pretext, about someone supposedly blowing up, railway lines as an excusa casus belli to invade Manchuria. And this sets off, first of all, the Japanese civilian leaders are not consulted. They are furious. Japanese army deals with civilian dissent the way that it normally does, by, screaming banzai and chopping people with samurai swords. And so Japanese, there is basically a wave of assassinations, throughout this period, especially in 1932 and again in 1936. All you need to know is any Japanese political leaders who were trying to hold back the military are killed, and the Japanese army has gotten Manchuria. But the problem was, every time they expand, they run into more and more problems. That it turns out the Chinese are not willing to accept this, so they invade certain parts of North China. The Chinese keep fighting. They invade more portions. They get caught in this sort of quagmire, and then they make the decision in 1937 to expand the war even farther following the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and this leads to the Second Sino-Japanese War, which is the long and short of it is a bloodbath. Where is this all going to? The one nation that had significant sentimental attachment to China, and not really a great economic relationship, not yet, is the United States. The United States is deeply, the Europeans are concerned, but they don't really have the ability to do very much about this. And they don't really want to be worried about Japan when they've also got to worry about, the Axis, not the Axis just yet, but, the Germans and the Italians in Europe. So they're really trying to sort of limit their exposure within the Far East. But the United States takes a very dim view of what the Japanese are doing. It starts to imply increasing degrees of economic pressure, starting with a quote unquote moral embargo in 1937. But again, what the main thing they're doing is sending military aid to China to resist the Japanese. You think of, and the Flying Tigers and others. And that, because the Japanese control all the coastal regions, all of this is having to come in through Southeast Asia, through Indochina and other places like that. So the Japanese army takes a position. Again, they're caught in this escalatory trap of violence. They find themselves in this mess. The only thing they can do is to expand the war and hope that that'll solve their problems. They make a decision that once France collapses in May, June 1940, they can invade northern Indochina to halt the flow of supplies into China that they believe is encouraging Chiang Kai-shek to keep fighting. Once they do that, the Americans, really, put the screws on the Japanese, and they basically limit Japan's ability to import oil by putting it all on a licensing basis. You have to apply for an import license. It can only be at a certain octane level. And the Japanese have the money to be able to import this oil, but they're finding it's, bureaucratically speaking, it's very, very difficult. The Americans are limiting the amount and quality and the amount and quality of oil that is petroleum that is being shipped to Japan. And then the Japanese, because the war is still not going well, the Japanese then make a decision in 1941 to invade all of Indochina. And at this point, it happens almost by accident while people on the weekend, while Roosevelt and Cordell Hull are not in town. Dean Acheson, who is the Undersecretary of State, basically imposes an oil embargo on Japan by refusing to authorize any export licenses. He hasn't told anybody. When everyone comes back to Washington the next week, they realize what's happened, but everyone's afraid to basically dial back what Acheson has done, because they think, well, if we do this without getting concessions from the Japanese, we'll look weak. Whereas this was an accident, but if we give in and admit our mistake, we'll look like we're giving into aggression, because the American government at this point is caught between. There are no doves. It's between, to use a sort of British term, they're like the Easterners and the Westerners. Okay, there are, the Japanese army is, the American army is focused on developing the force to protect the Western Hemisphere, and ultimately, if necessary, to support Britain, and if necessary, participate in the war on the Allied side to liberate Europe. Even in 1940-41, they're thinking along those lines. And in 41, you have planning starting on a basis in the spring of 41. But on the other hand, there are hawks within the administration. I'm thinking of people like Harold Ickes, who is in charge of the Petroleum Administrator for War within and Secretary of the Interior, various New Dealers, people within the State Department, East Asia hands, and also the American Navy, who are more interested in the Pacific. And of course, there's this general with a flair for fashion, General Douglas MacArthur, who has become sort of field marshal and head of the Philippine Army, who is out there in Manila, also talking about the threat from Japan and how America's interests are in the Pacific. So Roosevelt is in this weird position where he does not want war with the Japanese because he is focused on Germany, but he cannot allow the Japanese to continue their aggression, particularly because the Japanese make what they think is a sort of clever move of allying with Germany and Italy in 1940 with the tripartite pact, which then suddenly completely sort of blows up in their face, because now the Americans see them as all sort of tied with one another. But because of the sheer complexity of what you're doing, waging war on opposite sides of the earth, you really don't want to deal with the war of the Japanese. So you're constantly trying to sort of use economic carrots and inducements to sort of force them to pull back out of China, but not put them in the position where they have no option but to fight. The embargo happens in 1941, and the clock is running, for the Japanese. They understand with their existing reserves, at existing rates of consumption, they will be out of oil in 18 months. That is it. Like it is over. And no oil, the war is over. There's no point in even fighting. So the Japanese are in this position where you can either give up your empire in China, or you can fight. That is now, again, part of the problem was, I talked with one historian, is that different people have control over different parts of the oil. Like if the Japanese army had sacrificed its oil, if the Japanese Navy had sacrificed its oil so you could maintain operations in China, you could have kept on operation. You could have kept on operations up there, but you would have been defenseless in the Pacific. And of course, an important thing to bear in mind is the Japanese army and navy hate each other more than they hate the outside party. I mean, they are murdering one another. Yamamoto has to be pulled out of Tokyo to head the combined fleet because they are worried the Japanese army is going to assassinate him, because he is seen as being opposed to the alliance with Germany. The Navy tends to be not pro-British or pro-American, that's too strong a word, but it tends to be very skeptical of the Germans, where the Japanese army, because it's trained and modeled on the German army, has much closer relations with them and and has affinities with National Socialism as well. They are whole hog on that side. So I once made a point to the great historian Michael Barnard, on Japan's economic preparations for war. I said, Did Japan attack Pearl Harbor so that the Japanese Navy did not have to share its oil with the Japanese army? And he thought for a moment, and he said, that's overstated. It's a little bit exaggerated, but it's not entirely inaccurate either.
Wow.
I mean, if Japan is going to maintain its position, and not just its position in China, but also the balance between the army and the Navy, you need to expand into what is known as the Southern Resource Area, and that's where suddenly now you are worried about oil from the East Indies. You are worried about oil, rubber from Malay and other things like that, because now you are cut off from your traditional import routes. And but the only way the Japanese can do that is you can either put pressure on the British and the Dutch, who are the major players in the East Indies, to send you oil. They're not keen on doing that because they don't want to be seen as enabling Japanese aggression either. And the Americans are telling them don't do that either. So the Japanese have no option but to invade this territory. And once you've invaded this territory, well, first of all, the Americans are aware that the Japanese are doing this. They are aware that, while the Japanese ambassador is meeting with Cordell Hull in November 1940 for the last-ditch sort of talks, the Japanese military is making preparations to invade the East Indies and to seize these territories. So the Americans feel the Japanese are acting in bad faith, and they basically say, you want sanctions lifted, you have to basically withdraw from China. You have to basically surrender. The Japanese are in this position where they had gotten into this mess because of their desire to be a continental land power like Germany and other nations, but they end up in this sort of quagmire. They're not able to extricate themselves. Every attempt at expanding and escalating the war increases the number of their adversaries, whether it's going to be the Chinese, the Soviets, and then eventually the Americans. The problem with the Americans is they are your major economic trading partner. They are your major supplier of oil and other things like that. To go to war against your major supplier of energy, not a smart move. And the only possible way you can square this circle is by seizing the East Indies. But again, if you're going to seize the East Indies, you need to then protect the supply routes to the home islands, which means you need to expand the war into the Philippines. You expand the war into the Philippines, you bring the Americans into it. If you bring the Americans into it, it makes no sense to leave the American Pacific Fleet untouched, which means you have to attack Pearl Harbor. And this is all the Japanese Navy's thinking. The Japanese could not care less about this. They are not interested in the East Indies and Pearl Harbor and any of this nonsense. They are interested in China. They are interested in the Soviet Union. The Navy, as far as they can tell, has gotten them into this mess. The Navy can sort of get it out, can figure out a way out of this, but the Navy can't do some of these things like sever supply lines to Australia or occupy Hawaii, or do these things that are necessary if you're going to defeat the Americans without the Japanese army contributing troops. Japanese army isn't interested in doing that. So the Japanese ultimately bumble into this war, a war that they know that they will almost certainly lose, but they are unwilling to accept the alternative, which in their culture would be not only dishonorable, but ultimately mean a political revolution in Japan, because the groups that had run this country and had claimed that that they were sort of the people who had created modern Japan and made it a great power had in fact led the country squarely into the ditch.
Okay, thank you. So you just said this. So the Japanese have bumbled their way into a war. The significance of China has come through again. We talked about this before going live, and I kind of can't believe that sort of 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and I was starting to learn about World War II, we never talked about China at all, except in that kind of cursory, we sent a few aircraft in the Flying Tigers kind of way, but it's a key part of this. Meanwhile, the Third Reich, who also cannot sustain a long war, they've got to get things done quick, have begun their things. So let's take it to sort of to the late part of 41 for the Third Reich and the early part of 42 for the Japanese. Both Axis powers, and I guess the Italians, because they're still in North Africa, have kind of got what they wanted, even though they sort of didn't deserve to in terms of their bumbling nature. Japan has now got its huge expanded empire, if you want to call it that. The Third Reich is still battling in deep into the Soviet Union, and Italy is still controlling North Africa. At that point, obviously, trade routes, oil supplies, the quantities of stuff being used, everything has changed. The picture you painted of how the situation been in the 1930s, the stakes are up. The stakes are increased. The numbers of aircraft, the numbers of ships, the numbers of everything has gone off the charts. So, it's a dumb question, but kind of what happens next?
So, at the beginning of 1940, at the end of 41, beginning of 42, the Axis have a tremendous amount of territory that they have, under their control. The Japanese have created, in terms of square miles, even though most of it's ocean, the largest empire the world has ever seen. The Germans have, they have been stopped, outside of Moscow, and they have not occupied Leningrad, but they have, overrun Ukraine. Their forces are active in North Africa, and they're waging a sort of air-sea campaign to try and starve, Britain into surrender. But in fact, this situation is fraught with peril because you are now in a position where, if you are the Germans, you never wanted yourself to be in. You are caught fighting a protracted war in Eastern Europe, while at the same time having to deal with the Americans and the British, who pose an air-sea threat from the West. Germany can maybe fight one of these things at a time. It cannot fight both of them at the same time. The resource constraints are far too great for the Germans to be able to do this. And most importantly, there are At the end of 41, as I sometimes lecture to my students, there are three important sets of decisions that happen within the Third Reich's leadership. The least important decision is the decision to declare war on the United States. That is almost taken as an afterthought by the Americans, primarily because the German Navy had been pushing for several months to expand unrestricted submarine operations to the American coast and American ships, because the Americans had taken the position that they were going to start escorting convoys at least to a certain point in the Atlantic before turning them over to the Royal Navy. The German Navy, it had not learned this lesson in the First World War. It was determined to make the same mistake again. It was convinced that you just have to unleash our U-boats against the Americans and we'll make certain that nobody gets across to Europe. Of course, they fail. But they are pushing the Americans, they are pushing the Reich towards doing this, not realizing that, again, the Allies are actually just steering their convoys around U-boats because they're reading through Ultra, they are reading German Enigma communications. The Germans feel like, the German Navy is pushing for this because they, this is the only way for them to sort of, in a sense, be relevant. So first decision, declare war against the United States. Almost an afterthought, really just, again, because the German Navy is demanding things, and also because the Japanese are in the war, and there's a belief that, you can't allow the Americans to concentrate their resources against Japan. You need to declare war against them so that they have to spread their resources between the two theaters. Second decision is the decision to exterminate Europe's Jews, and there's a huge amount of debate about this particular issue. I am of the school of thought that says the decision to exterminate Soviet Jews happens over the course of Barbarossa in June, July 1941. But the fate of the European Jews, the Jews within Eastern and Western Europe, that is only sealed in 1941, when there's the Germans, in their sort of belief of a vast Jewish conspiracy, believe that you have to keep these Jews alive as sort of hostages, to keep the Jews in London and Washington, on side. But once both of them are sort of unified, and determined to fight Germany, there's no point in keeping these people alive, particularly because they might also be a potential fifth column that would lead to another revolution and stab in the back, as you had in World War I. You might as well just get rid of them altogether. And, there's an element here of sort of a blood pact between the German people and the regime that nobody can claim that somehow, they weren't a part of this. Everybody has to everyone's, in for a penny, in for a pound. Everybody has to be complicit. Everyone has to take, responsibility for their actions. The third and most important, I believe, on a military strategic level, is Hitler's admission, according to his operations chief Alfred Jodl, his admission that he did not see how Germany could win the war any longer. He says, Jodl said in 1945, in December of 41, Hitler confessed that he did not know how victory could be achieved any longer. Now, that does not mean that Germany's defeat is inevitable, but it does mean that the existing German strategy of fighting blitzkrieg, of sort of limited, short, sharp wars of maneuver and overwhelming violence against, specific adversaries, and sort of, gathering resources and turning on the next one, your existing, way of war had failed. You are now in what the Germans had always feared. You are waging another Materialschlacht, battle of material. And if you are going to do that, you need to create the economic bases to be able to support that Materialschlacht. That is going to mean you are going to have to mobilize, really, not to overstate, Albert Speer's contributions, but you're going to have to, do more to sort of ruthlessly cut back on civilian consumption. It's not like the Germans are living high on the hog beforehand, but you will have to, do more to reduce civilian consumption, but you will also have to secure the resources necessary to be able to wage a protracted war. And you also need to improve your strategic position, whereby even if you cannot defeat the Soviet Union is not able to threaten Germany. The way in which the Germans settle upon doing that is by attacking the Caucasus in 1942, because you no longer have the ability to launch an attack across the entire front. You have to concentrate on one of the three fronts. Moscow is where the Red Army is, probably to an extent, is expecting the Germans to attack. But again, destroying Moscow or attacking or occupying it is not going to achieve those aims I talked about beforehand. Leningrad, even less so. I mean, maybe you might be able to sort of limit trade, via the Arctic, convoy route. But again, in 1942, that's still really a trickle, considering the losses the Allies are taking in their Arctic convoys. So that just leaves the Caucasus as a place where you can secure oil, which pleases, which is necessary for the German war effort. It will allow you to destroy significant Soviet armies, which will keep the German army happy, and it will ideally, even if it does not destroy the Soviet Union, and again, I see no evidence that anybody thought in Germany after 1942 that you could destroy the Soviet Union. I think everyone has given up on that. The Germans are fighting what we call a quote unquote limited war, in a Clausewitzian sense, that they are seeing that this war needs to be ended by negotiation. And I don't mean like they sit down at a peace treaty, but at some point people have to just admit that they can't defeat Germany, or the costs will be too great. So you have to put the Soviets in a position where they cannot maintain offensive operations, and you need to build up resources to be able to deal with the Americans and the British, who will be coming in 43, 44, by the time they mobilize. That means you need to sort of make use of you take an action that's going to improve your position, and that means striking at the Caucasus, because it's not only do you need the oil for yourself, but you also need to deny that oil to the Soviets, because if the Soviets have no oil, they have no real ability to maintain offensive operations. They can keep fighting, but offensive operations are going to be really difficult, and there's no real supplies of oil that they can draw on, besides the Caucasus, because again, as I mentioned before, the Volga Urals and Siberia are just a glimmer in the Soviet oil industry's eyes. It's still not a reality just yet.
Right.
You deny this oil to the Soviets, they are not going to be able to do anything. And in fact, they will be hard pressed not to have a famine, because there will be no fuel for what limited sort of, amounts are left for agriculture, because you've got a labor shortage, because everyone's in the Red Army. So who's going to be, you need to rely on tractors and whatever mechanization you can as a labor saving technology. That's going to make them impose a further drain on the Allies via American Lend-Lease to keep the Soviet population alive.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So that they can stay in the fight. That is the logic for, as I argued in an article I wrote about the 42 campaign, that is the logic that is undergirding Germany's decision to strike at the Caucasus, when there is also the alternative, because you're talking about, well, where do the Japanese and the Germans sort of fit into it? The Japanese have achieved this empire, right? They've theoretically, they're the dog that caught the car. But the problem is they haven't destroyed the American fleet. They destroyed, they sank a few old battleships, and they damaged a few others, but they don't destroy the American carriers. The Americans are, have not. The Japanese war plan had assumed that eventually you would have this sort of massive cataclysmic battle, and that once you had destroyed the American fleet, the Americans would understand that it would take too long for them to build up new power to be able to sort of destroy Japan's navy and strangle Japan through blockade. That doesn't really work. You get the territory, but you don't really inflict a crippling defeat of American naval power. And the Americans are also building another second and third fleet because of the Vincent Act. So any ships you destroy in 1941, 42 are going to be replaced in 43, 44. It's really not, you're really not in this position where you have a way out of this. So the Japanese Navy has to think about, well, what can it do? It has two options. One option, and some of your people you've had on the show before can talk about it. One option, which Yamamoto is very keen on, is trying to basically lure the remains of the American fleet, out and destroy them in another set piece battle, which may in turn allow you to move towards Hawaii, which one would argue is, if there was one thing Japan could have done, could have really complicated the scenario for the Americans, it would have been to invade Hawaii. I don't think it would have been possible, but if they had been able to do it, the war would have lasted a lot longer than it actually did. Because without Hawaii, staging in the Westpac is virtually impossible unless you go, through the South Pacific, which then is the reason why Guadalcanal is so important, because the Japanese are advancing in Southeast Asia, trying to cut off supply lines to Australia. That's why the Americans send what precious forces they have in 42 to Guadalcanal. But that's leaving aside, Yamamoto has a choice. He wants to destroy the remainder of the American fleet because he believes that it'll give him the flexibility he needs to be able to do what he wants. But it's really, it's hard to see much strategic logic behind that. Other elements of the Japanese Navy are pushing towards advancing in the Indian Ocean, because they have not just attacked American interest in the Pacific. They have also, they're also fighting against, they're also fighting against the British and the Dutch as well, because that's what you need to do to be able to that's what you need to do in order to seize the East Indies. And there's idea of basically threatening the British Empire in India. But again, that's more of an army thing. The Japanese Navy, some in the Japanese Navy in the operation, some Japanese naval strategists see, however, operations in the Indian Ocean as a way of linking their efforts with the Axis, who would theoretically come via North Africa into the Middle East and basically sever the British Empire in half by meeting in the Indian Ocean. That is a potential sort of alternative and a potential option that is seen. And also the Japanese could, in a sense, help to threaten Britain's control of the Middle East, because the Germans are aware that they need the oil from the Caucasus, but eventually, after they've taken the oil from the Caucasus, they do need to strike at the Middle East and strike at Britain's interests there, primarily its oil interests. But that is, anyways. So some of the Japanese Navy and the German Navy see this as a potential option, a way to sort of link their two powers to sort of cripple the British Empire. But the problem they run into is that even if you're able to, if India falls, the British Empire does not fall. If the Indian Ocean falls, the British Empire does not fall. Like if the Middle East falls, the British Empire and Britain are two separate things entirely. Yeah, you can grab all this territory, but it's not going to convince the British to surrender. I mean, they had lost Singapore, they had lost Hong Kong, they had lost Burma, but again, that's not something that's going to convince Britain to give up the war, especially now that the Americans are into it. So again, this brief sort of window of possibility of joint German-Japanese operations in the spring of 42 passes pretty quickly, because it runs into the fact that operations without any overarching strategic rationale have no purpose. It will neither achieve Japan nor Germany's political objectives. So why would you do that? Simply running up the clock, putting points on the board for the sake of putting points on the board, as Clausewitz would say, is going beyond your culminating point of victory. So the German, Hitler makes it very clear he's not interested in these kinds of diversions, even though he values the alliance with Japan very much. He's just not interested in these diversions. The German army has no interest in any of this. The German Air Force has nothing interest in this. It is the Japanese Navy and the German Navy that are thinking in these sort of global terms, but they don't really have a plausible theory of victory either. So the brief window passes in the spring of 42, and the Germans do commit towards the Caucasus operation. The Japanese, of course, make decisions that will ultimately lead them to their defeat and destruction of much of their carrier force at Midway.
And thank you very much. And during that period when the Third Reich and the Axis have kind of boxed themselves into a corner in 42, but at the same time, the Allies have not got their full war effort going. The analogy I use is they've got a big dam, but they're still filling it up, the lake up with buckets of water, and it will it's still at that stage. Eventually, they will have enough in that dam to unleash all the things they unleash in I guess from late 43 into 44 and 45, and by 44 they can have not just one operation running in one part of the world. They can have 3 or 4 operations, and but in 42, that's still not possible. The Allies are having to, if we go here, then it means we can't go there. So at the same time, because the Allies are churning out aircraft, they're churning out everything else. Where on the list is oil in terms of the US? Let's take the US to begin with. On their things they're worried about in late 42, moving into 43, where is oil for the US?
Well, again, the Americans are the world's dominant oil producer, and they have a tremendous amount of latent power because in the 1930s, after the First World War, there was a fear that there was one of these brief periods that are common in sort of global history, but fears that existing oil fields are going to sort of run out and we're going to run out of oil. Mexico at the time, sort of its oil production peaks after the First World War and sort of declines precipitously afterwards. There's this belief that, oh my God, we're going to run out of oil. What are we going to do? Of course, when you raise the price of oil, you encourage people to explore for oil. It turns out that, by the mid-1920s, you are awash in a sea of oil from newer fields starting in places like Oklahoma, California, but then the big one is in East Texas in 1930, which is sort of, the East Texas oil field, in a sense, is, East Texas alone is producing more than all of Axis Europe, did during the Second World War. I mean, it's just sort of ocean of oil that that they find. So America's problem isn't oil. America's problem is the fact that what is happening is oversupply, for one thing, which is really not a good thing in the oil industry, because if there's oversupply, it encourages people to sort of produce more and more oil to try and capture whatever markets or earnings that they can, which only drives the price of oil further down, and also is really bad for the long-term health of oil fields. There's a certain, if you want to maximize the amount of oil or gas you are extracting from a field, there are certain practices, and they are very specific to particular fields. I don't want to generalize, but there are certain, you want to produce at a certain rate in order to maximize the long-term health of the field and recoverability rate. But if this is a crash, sort of thing about producing whatever I can because I gotta sell whatever I can right now, it's just sort of this race to the bottom. So what happens in the 1930s is there's a series of legislative actions. The federal government tries through the New Deal to sort of regulate oil production because the problem is the price of oil is too low. There comes a point in time where oil in Texas is going at like 10 cents a barrel. I mean, it's cheaper than water, at one point, because you were awash in this oil and there's no demand for it because of the Great Depression. But the American government the federal government does not have the power to be able to regulate the internal affairs of economic affairs of the states, especially how they operate their oil industry. So federal attempts to create unified legislation for the oil industry fail. And so what happens is a series of sort of state level measures that sort of build on one another and effectively regulate production. So in Texas, you have what is known as pro-rationing. Pro-rationing, which is administered by an organization called the Texas Railroad Commission. Pro-rationing is an attempt to sort of say, okay, everybody gets to produce a certain amount of oil. Like, that is it, because we need to conserve our oil fields, and by that, it has nothing to do with the environment. Conservation is about, we want to maintain a healthy, viable, long-term oil industry that requires conservation, as they call it. Conservation requires pro-rationing, so everyone gets to produce a certain amount of oil. And you also then have something called the Connolly Hot Oil Act, which makes it a federal crime to sell oil produced in excess of pro-rationed limits, especially because a lot of this is going across state lines. And once across the state lines, it becomes a federal issue. And then states also interact with one another through an interstate oil compact to try and sort of coordinate their pro-rationing sort of efforts on one another. And what it does is it just basically reduces American oil production well below its possible capacity, so that you're not overproducing, you're not providing people with oil they don't need. You're not cratering oil prices, which are going to hurt, future exploration and investment because you can't earn enough from it. But this also means that when America makes a decision to go to war, or even before it's going to go to war, because demand is already increasing in 1940 as the economy picks up, you can basically, by turning dials on various oil fields, you can basically increase production by over 1 million barrels per day. And so the Americans go from 3 to 4 million barrels a day almost overnight. Once the allowable rates go to sort of 100%, like it's you've got all this latent capacity, and that in turn means that oil from the United States, for a variety of reasons, is the primary source of energy for the Allies. Of course, beyond leaving aside the Soviet Union, it is the Americans are supplying roughly about 80% of the oil that all the Allies are consuming. Again, leaving aside the Soviet Union, British Empire, all their allies, 80% of that oil comes from the United States, and the United States is also able to supply even the Soviet Union with certain high quality oil products like aviation, gasoline, and others, because the Soviets don't necessarily have the refining capacity to produce some of this stuff as well. So the Americans are not just producing volume; they're also able to supply their allies with certain specialty products, because it's in the sort of slide deck you have. The Americans not only dominate world oil production, they also dominate world refining production as well. They have the most advanced sort of industry in the world when it comes to exploration practices, production practices, refining practices. So they're able to play this sort of immense role to the point where they don't even need to take advantage of Venezuela. I mean, I remember one of the most fascinating things I learned, and it's in the Shell official history, is that Venezuelan oil production goes up slightly during the war, but actually there's no real reason to expand it as much as it needed to, because Venezuelan oil was actually, the quality was not great for what the Allies needed in terms of high-end petroleum products. A lot of Venezuelan oil before the war had been refined in fuel oil, a lot of for naval purposes. There wasn't a huge demand for it. So basically, the Allies were able to make do even without Venezuela, which, again, as I said, had been Europe's primary supplier before the war. The Americans are able to fuel their own war effort on both ends of the planet and supply their allies, and they do so internally. The problem that the Allies have is a problem of, like you said, it's about how do you fill up this bucket. It's a question of economic management, not of actually like simple scarcity of goods. It's a question of, the Allies, as I point out, the Americans are caught in this sort of weird sort of conundrum where they don't want oil prices to be too high, right? Because if oil prices are too high, it's going to contribute to inflation. And inflation's a problem, obviously, for an economy, because it's going to sap political will. It's going to, lead to all sorts of economic and political dislocation. So you want to try and keep inflation down as much as possible, because once it starts happening, once there's a wage price spiral and labor, this will lead to labor unrest and labor versus capital, and it's going to be a distraction. Roosevelt is using his own personal authority, his personal moral authority as the sort of most popular president in, really perhaps since Washington, to force labor to not demand as much as it wants, not go on strike, and so that means he needs to keep inflation in check as well, so that labor does not make demands against capital. And there are also limits in terms of the American Congress's ability to pass adequate legislation, tax legislation, in order to tax excess profits and income, because that's, again, going to create all sorts of political issues. So there's this balancing act. You don't want oil prices to be too high, because that'll create inflation. But if oil prices are too low, no one will search for new oil, which means that you might be creating future shortages in future. So it's interesting, at the same time this is all happening, during the Second World War, the Americans started to, some Americans like Harold Ickes, and it took me a long time to realize to separate the public propaganda from what they actually believe. But publicly, there's a great belief that America is draining itself of oil, to fight the Second World War, and this means that America must expand into foreign oil fields in Latin America and in the Middle East, and this will be an increasing preoccupation of American foreign policy, not after the Second World War, but even during the war. As early as 1942 or 43, people start to make this argument about America, because of the demands of supplying the Allies, needs to have a more aggressive foreign oil policy, and there's an attempt to create, there's an attempt to try and create there's a firm in Saudi Arabia, it is originally what is known as the Standard Oil Company of California, and it is operating with, SoCal has a concession in Saudi Arabia. It then creates a partnership with Texaco. This company is eventually called the Arabian. It's first called the California Arabian Standard Oil Company. It then is eventually renamed the Arabian American Oil Company. The short version is Aramco, which maybe you've heard of. That company has a concession. There's actually an attempt to create, like with the British and Anglo-Persian, a state-backed oil company in the Persian Gulf, in Saudi Arabia, to supply the U.S. Navy with oil. In the post-war period, it collapses because of political opposition to government interference in private industry. But even at this period, there's already, because of the demands of fighting war, there's a question of, okay, what price do I want? Because the price I want is going to determine my level of economic activity, but it'll also affect my future productivity in terms of finding new sources of oil. And the other thing that the Americans are running into is that, again, just having the oil is no use if you can't get it to where it needs to be. Mm. Where the Germans initially have a tremendous amount of success, with Operation Drumbeat, Augenschlag, is by targeting American oil tankers that are traversing between the Gulf of Mexico and the East Coast, because the United States has certain energy surplus regions and energy deficit regions. Texas will supply, other parts of the country that can't supply themselves, like the region I'm in, New England. No oil here, so it's got to be imported. The best way to do it is to transship it by coastal trade through tankers. This presents for several months anyways, mainly because of the incompetence of the American Navy, presents, an irresistible target to German U-boats. And we're fortunate the Germans didn't have enough U-boats to really make a dent or to really sort of, put us on the back foot. But this also means that the Americans now have to think about, well, if our tankers are vulnerable on the East Coast or in the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico, how do we sort of ship the oil to where it needs to go internally? That requires the construction of pipelines. Pipelines require, again, steel, labor, other material that could be used for the war effort. So the Allies have to make certain decisions about management rather than sort of absolute scarcity. You might have all these resources, but it doesn't obviate the need to think about how do I rationally plan for the allocation of resources, because the story of the American war mobilization is, you can have everything you want eventually, but you can't have it all at once at the same time. You have to build in stages. You have to do things logically. There's no point in building a factory if there's no machines for that factory. There's no point in building a factory with machines if there's no labor for that factory. There's no point in having a factory with machines and labor if there's no energy for that factory. Like, everything has to happen, in stages. And so the most important thing that happens in 1942 is there is what is known as the so-called great feasibility debate within the American war economy, that the War Production Board is split between civilian agencies and the military. And the civilian economists are saying that the military wants to be able to have a second front. The American Army wants to have a second front in Europe in 1943. We got to end this war as quickly as possible. The way we do it in good Clausewitzian fashion is strike at the center of gravity. That means, ejecting the Germans out of France and marching on Germany. That'll be it. We got to do it right away because Marshall is very insistent. Americans have no interest in protracted wars. We got to do this. Got to go big or go home. The problem with that is that in order to generate the level of economic that requires generating a certain level of economic activity, and the economists are basically telling the military that you cannot do this as quickly as you want. If you want to generate these amount of forces, you will have to wait until 1943. And there's a series of sort of vicious bureaucratic debates, but eventually the economists, and there's a famous story where one of these economists basically sort of choose out the head of the Army's service forces, a 3-star general, at a meeting in the most vulgar terms imaginable, where the Army eventually is browbeaten into accepting that there just simply isn't the resources to have a second front in 1943 because of this need to sort of logically expand American war production. Because what had happened in the First World War is America's had completely botched its mobilization, such that American doughboys, go to Europe but have to be outfitted with French equipment because, you're building American engines that can't fit into any fighter planes that Americans are designing. I mean, you produce 15,000 aircraft engines, but 0 fighter planes. I mean, like, what is going on here? American war production, America had tremendous potential, but because it's not a totalitarian state, because you're relying on private industry and there's a traditional reluctance to accept government interference in private industry, sort of creating the sort of processes and organizations that can regulate, private firms and harness them for the common good, that takes a bit of time. America had completely botched that in the First World War, and you wanted to do a better job in the Second. That means things have to unfold a little bit more carefully, but it also means I'm always thinking about balancing my short-term needs with my long-term health. And as I mentioned with oil, do I want high oil prices or do I want low oil prices? Both of them have drawbacks and both of them have weaknesses.
Okay, so well, again, brilliant stuff. So you've talked about inflation, you've talked about the economy, you've talked about this high-level subject of oil and its distribution. But for a lot of people watching, when we think of fuel in World War II, we think much on a sort of the day-to-day scale. We think of the fact that the jerry can was an amazing invention. We think of drop tanks on the P-51 Mustang. We think of the idea of the Germans having to take tubes to siphon fuel out in the Ardennes. From your point of view, who looks at oil in a much more complex, overarching view, are those stories of drop tanks and jerry cans a distraction to the main subject of, in fact, the war is being won at a much more sophisticated, higher level, or are they still fundamentally important, or are they separate to the study of oil, if that makes sense as a question?
Well, it all depends on what level of war you're interested in. Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to say that something is like less important than something else. I mean, look, I teach strategy, but whenever sometimes I tell my students that, I'm not a strategist. No one's a strategist. I've yet to meet a strategist, but supposedly they exist. Anyways, I'm teaching it. But I point out that just because, we're here talking about strategy doesn't mean that the other levels of war aren't important, or that they're somehow less sophisticated and require less brain power. There's some of this idea that strategies for the 50-pound brains, the boffins, as you call them, but tactics is for any sort of any dumb clod like Montgomery can figure out tactics. And I point out this one example where I and a bunch of PhDs had to sort of figure out a simple sort of tactical question that was posed in the Marine Corps Gazette. And, people spent like 20 minutes arguing about, well, what did the question actually mean? And then are we contextualizing the problem correctly? And what exactly is a platoon? And, what's an anti-personnel mine do? And I remember the instructor, like after 20 minutes, just sort of says, like, stop, just be aware. You have spent 20 minutes debating a question that would take a Marine second lieutenant precisely 30 seconds to solve. All right.
Right.
And then I'm like, oh, I'm the strategist. I'm going to answer the question. I'm like, this is what we do. And I came up with a sort of like grand idea about how you would emplace forces to deal with a certain issue. And the instructor said, congratulations, you failed. Like, what do you mean I failed? You left your flank wide open. The enemy, you assumed the enemy was going to come down the road. They just went around and rolled you up from the rear because you left your back door wide open. That taught me a great deal of humility. So I'm the last person to say that, well, I'm the last person to denigrate the heroism of overmatched and outnumbered American troops in the Ardennes, or the sheer sort of difficulty of what the Germans were trying to do, operating in this sort of heavily wooded territory while maintaining OPSEC and fighting an enemy that sort of vastly outnumbered them in terms of men and materiel, and doing all of this in the middle of winter in the dark in 6 feet of snow. Like, it is an incredible sort of accomplishment what both sides were able to do. The Germans will be able to pull off this offensive, and the Allies will sort of to beat it back. But again, what question are you seeking to answer? Are you seeking to answer, well, how do smaller forces exploit terrain in order to basically thwart an offensive in winter? That means, well, understanding the Ardennes on one level. You're talking about drop tanks. I mean, the question that I would ask is, like, if the Allies did not have drop tanks on the P-51, would it actually have mattered? I mean, my students love to, I sometimes ask my students, like, what's your favorite World War II movie? And they'll almost invariably say Private Ryan and Saving Private Ryan. And I say, that is a wretched movie. And they're like, what do you mean, Doc? Like, that was a great movie. I'm like, well, first of all, like, I start charting, the historical inaccuracies. Like, clearing Omaha Beach took 8 hours. It didn't take 15 minutes. First two waves got wiped out. The ranges are too close. Yada, yada, yada. And then people will say, oh, you can't, like, it's just a movie. You can't, like, expect realism. I'm like, no, the whole movie makes a fetish out of realism. You can't have it both ways. You can't make a fetish out of realism on the one hand and then, change things, to suit, plot level on the other hand. But I always make the final point at the very end. I said, let's just imagine the Germans do what they're supposed to do at the end of the war. At the end of the movie, they roll right over the Americans rather than sort of blundering into a trap. Imagine if, Saving Private Ryan gets sort of bayoneted, if, Tom Hanks gets run over by a Tiger tank. Would it have lengthened the war by even 5 minutes?
Yeah, good point.
Would it have merited even a single mention in the daily sitrep of the Supreme Allied Commander of Allied Expeditionary Forces? No, it would not. And once I said that, I said, what's the implication of that? And one student actually sort of thought, and he realized, the real heroes are not the troops who are fighting. This means the real heroes are the men and women of the production lines at home.
Yeah.
I said that is one potential way of looking at this issue. So again, I'm not saying that understanding the tactical and operational level is unimportant. It takes a great deal of skill and sophistication to be able to master war at these levels, and not to mention it takes a degree of bravery and foolhardy daring do that I have never been capable of as a physical example. But at the same time, I'm supposed to train my students to think at a level in which they do not spend most of their careers operating, but which, God willing, they will either hold that level or they will advise people to operate at that level. That
use the tools. Yeah.
I need to be able to shift them to consider the fact that, there might be limitations on your ability to use force. I'm not thinking about law or whatever, but you're always bound by certain political and economic constraints, and those two are actually really pretty much the same thing when you really boil it down to it. And if you are unaware of the political and economic context in which you operate, you will find that you are not able to use force as effectively as you might desire to achieve your political objective.
Thank you. You reminded me of in episode 3 of Band of Brothers, the counterattack at Bloody Gulch, just up the road from me in Normandy, when the German Stugs and Marders are approaching, and then the Second Armored arrive with their Shermans. And I was kind of familiar with the action, but I looked it up. The official Second Armored Division history gives it 2 sentences.
Yeah.
And the Eighth Corps official history doesn't mention it at all. I mean, it is so tiny as an event in the grand scheme of how they are enveloping Normandy, but it just didn't make a mention. So in terms of oil, one of the, sorry.
I'll just say, there's a moment of Band of Brothers that struck home to me. It's at the very end, the last episode, where all the Germans are marching as POWs on the Autobahn, and the Americans are driving by in their trucks. And one of the Americans starts screaming at the Germans, saying, "What the hell were you people thinking?"
Yeah, Webster. Yeah.
The nation of Henry Ford. What were you people thinking you were going to do? Like the sheer, that level of incredulity is certainly something that I can empathize with, because the idea that Germany would have taken on the United States and the Soviet Union and the British and French and Dutch empires all simultaneously, with Italy and Japan as their ally, is just mind-boggling strategic malpractice when you think about it. So that, you talk about me, that's a moment which sort of speaks to what on earth were you people think you were doing? Not to take anything away from the bravery of the poor bloody infantry that has to actually engage with the enemy, or guys who suffered even worse, the pilots flying the strategic bombing missions, who suffered a casualty rate 10 times as high as the infantry. They got to go home to warm beds every night, but they were getting slaughtered. I mean, in 1943, it is statistically impossible for an American bomber pilot to survive their tour of duty, over Northern Europe. I mean, not to take anything away from that bravery, but again, that level of production and sophistication of production design, distribution, and application of force that is truly what marks the American war effort. This is why, Martin Van Creveld wrote that book, German, Fighting Power, which pissed off a lot of, people for a long time. But it makes, a central point is that, and I think, you mentioned Philip Blood before, I think you would probably agree with this. I've started to read some of his stuff on Substack, is that, the Germans have this sort of warrior mentality. They have this sort of pre-modern view of heroism and bravery, and it's about individual initiative and action and sort of unleashing the sort of warrior spirit. And this leads to sort of tremendous degrees of feats of bravery and heroism and brutality as well, even before the Third Reich. But ultimately, it's this sort of pre-modern way of thinking about war, because the modern way of war is a war not only of machines, but, as we're seeing increasingly, a war of interlinked machines and systems and sensors, and platforms, where the individual's job is not to engage with the enemy individually, but to coordinate the actions of all these machines. So, that's why, when I went to Poland and I'm just, seeing all these Ukrainians, as I said to my Polish host, these guys do not look like Americans. It's like, what do you mean? It's they're wearing American uniforms, but they're all forgive me, they're all fat, overweight guys in their 40s and 50s. They're not like the sort of, chiseled Adonises of the American military, because these guys are not interested in that sort of, this is not a game for them. They're not fashion models. They're there. They've inflicted enormous casualties and losses on the Russians, and they've done so because they have a superior understanding of the nature and demands of modern warfare as well. Germans have this sort of tremendous sort of military existence, and there is a lot to be said for certain aspects of how they're organized, but it is fundamentally a pre-modern way of organizing your military forces, and it has no place in the modern world. Even if Germany had not suffered the defeat that it did, there's no place for something like the Wehrmacht or its predecessors in the modern world.
Thank you. Well, I mean, my takeaway, and I don't want to belittle the incredible work you've done in your papers and your books, is that in a sense it was all predetermined. The Third Reich and the Japanese, by their foolishness, have, as I said earlier, boxed themselves into a corner. But it's about, at the time, though, the perceptions. I mean, John Marshall's 1942 book is imminent, and in 1942, the Western world absolutely does not know it's going to win the war. There's there's an optimism that they're going to, but it absolutely still looks like the war is hanging in the balance. And then you get towards 43 and it looks a little bit more certain, and 44 a little bit more certain still. But in a sense, it's kind of all, it's sort of predetermined. The eventual outcome is predetermined to some extent. Is that fair?
No, I would just rephrase it just ever so slightly.
Okay.
Like, the knowledge that you are going to win the war. I mean, I still think, I still think Churchill's, remark, and he says this in his post-war history. I don't know whether or not he felt this at the time. I would suspect he did. He's like, when he hears about Pearl Harbor, this immense sense of relief, he has, because, I knew, like he says in a rough paraphrase, like, I knew we would win, like,
Yeah.
we would, the Japanese and the Germans would be, ground into powder between, thanks to American industrial power. The knowledge that you are going to win by sheer amount of material does not necessarily have anything to do with when you win and at what cost you win. I think that is the most important thing to bear in mind. Just saying the Allies had the overwhelming capacity should not eliminate the scope for human decisions to basically screw up a good thing. Germany, whatever I feel about Adam Tooze's work, and I'm ambivalent, he's not the only one, but he makes this point very strongly. Like, Germany loses the war in the summer of 1940, he argues, when the British make a decision not to negotiate, to accept Hitler's quote unquote peace offer.
Right.
And they do so because one man, Churchill, decided in the face of all strategic logic and strategic and political logic that he would continue, the war would continue, there would be no accommodation with the Germans, and he would put his faith entirely in the Americans, who had shown themselves to be utterly unreliable, up to that point, and he would trust that the Americans would eventually come into the war and that they would also, support Britain's war effort completely, because again, the British had no capacity to wage war, especially after France's surrender. So this was the decision that an individual took in the face of all strategic logic. Had Churchill made another decision, or had someone else become prime minister, things would have looked very, very, very different. Never underestimate, the scope for of certain people to make certain decisions at certain points in time that turn out to have outsized differences. And, one hypothetical that I sketched out in my piece about the Caucasus was that, even if the Germans, and I was not the first person to make this argument, another scholar, Joel Hayward, had sort of first sketched it out, even the Germans had not been able to occupy the Caucasian oil fields, and I made the argument that I didn't think they ever really planned on doing that. I think that's sort of a mistake to even think they thought they would get to Baku. They did at a certain point in time have the ability to wage a bombing campaign against these oil fields, and theoretically they could have imposed severe damage on these oil fields. And there's a German source which I cited somewhere, which said, like, we have the potential capacity to set back Soviet oil production for to really sort of cripple it for several months. And it's worth asking yourself, imagine if the Germans are able to really disrupt Soviet oil production, either production or transportation, and imagine that the war lasts a year longer. What would the world have looked like if the war had lasted a year longer? There's no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Without Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, would there have been a Cold War? Not entirely clear. The Soviets would not have, more than likely, not been able to intervene in China. If they had not been able to intervene in China, they would not have been able to assist the People's Republic, the CCP, which means that the nationalists would have almost certainly won the Chinese Civil War, and China would be ruled by a nationalist government, not the CCP. And of course, the atomic bomb would have been used in Europe first, not in Asia. At a very practical level, the longer, as Gerhard Weinberg once said, all these German operational geniuses, all they would have achieved was making certain the atomic bomb is dropped on Berlin and not on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. So imagine just changing the outcome by a few months, what it would have meant for the shape of the post-war world. I mean, the consequences are unimaginable for some when you think of something as an important event as the Second World War. So again, I'd say that just having all this stuff does not matter if you do not use it effectively as you can. We have seen with Russia and Ukraine, just having more people and having more stuff does not, obviate having people who understand modern warfare and are able to adapt faster than the others. It's also a question of, if Zelensky had fled Kiev like the Americans and others were telling him, I'm not certain the Ukrainians would have lasted. I think, honestly, Zelensky's decision to stay in Kiev prevented a collapse at the very beginning of the war, just like Stalin's decision to stay in Moscow, might have actually played a significant role in terms of, stiffening resistance to the point where, the Germans were unable to make further progress. And then, you have then, because of the knowledge you have from your spies in Japan, you're able to transfer your forces from Siberia and sort of, smash the Germans, once Typhoon fails. So again, nothing in history is predetermined. I mean, but at the same time, as Napoleon said, God is on the side of the big battalions. I'd rather have more stuff than not when I'm fighting certain kinds of war. When I'm fighting high-end, protracted, conventional war, having more stuff, as far as I can tell, is pretty much, unless you've got allies to make up that difference, and that's the only reason why Ukraine is still in the fight. The side that has more stuff almost invariably wins high-end conventional war. So it's a question of, what am I looking at? What's the level of war I'm looking at? What's the nature of the conflict? What are my political objectives? How do they relate to the adversary? These are things that are going to matter tremendously. And I think we see in the case of the Second World War as a certain kind of conflict, yes, having more stuff mattered tremendously, but using it mattered almost just how you use it mattered almost as much.
Yeah, the application and the timetable. Yeah. Well, I think we will bring it to end now, but I'm having multiple requests to bring you back in for a question and answer thing, because the questions have been flying in, most of which we can't get to because we'll be here all day. But if you'd be up for that, we'll do that in a few weeks' time. But folks, I'm going to also ask you, if you are interested in a paperback version of the Doctor's book, leave a comment after the show, because I'm going to give a list of people who are interested to the publishers, because we're trying to get a paperback edition. No guarantees, but we're trying. So if you are interested in the book, drop me a line or leave a comment so I can give the publisher some kind of ammunition to persuade them to do a new version, so we can get access to that. So yeah, people are saying they'll do that. So yeah, as always, well, these 2 times I've spoken to you, my brain is buzzing now with things, which is fantastic. But extraordinary stuff. So folks, I'm back again tomorrow. I'm talking to Sarah Vadik about the naval campaigns off the coasts of the USA in 42 and beyond. So I'm looking forward to that one. As always, click like and subscribe, buy my guest books, read their blogs, etc., etc., etc. But Dr. Toprani, I will speak to you again at some point. Thank you very much, viewers. It's been brilliant. Cool. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.